Hey everybody! So, we just spent a whole topic learning about atoms, about all the particles that make up atoms, and how they can be radioactive, and how different forms of atoms are called isotopes. Now we're looking at how atoms can actually be found in nature, in materials. So, to do this, we're not really concerned with what's inside atoms anymore. We can just think of atoms as a whole particle now. So we'll be using circles and other shapes to represent atoms. So that's our representation of an atom. It's just a circle to make it easier. Okay, so remember that atoms they're the smallest whole particle that can exist on its own. So we know that from last topic. The smallest whole particle. So we know that they're made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, but those don't exist on their own. They always exist inside atoms in materials. Okay, so let's look at the first way that atoms can exist in a material. So here we've got a chunk of carbon. So this is what carbon looks like in its pure form. And if we zoom in into this chunk of carbon, we would actually see that it's made up of lots and lots of carbon atoms, all next to each other. And only carbon atoms. And obviously, if we look at one particular carbon atom, if we zoomed in on that, we'd see what we expect. We've got a carbon atom, and remember that carbon is element number 6. So we've got 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons here. So in a material, if a material is made up of all the same atom, then that's called an element. So elements are made of only one type of atom. So remember that the periodic table lists all the different chemical elements, and there's 118 of them. So there's 118 different materials that are made up of just one type of atom. So there's carbon, you can have pure oxygen, that's an element. You can have sulfur, you can have sodium. Every element on the periodic table can exist in its elemental form, we call it. Okay, so here's another example of an element. This one is actually lithium. And lithium's a metal. So if we zoom in on this little piece of metal in lithium, we'd find a whole lot of lithium atoms making it up. And again, if we zoom in on an individual lithium atom, we can see those all have 3 protons. Most of them have 4 neutrons, depending on the isotope, and 3 electrons. And that's because lithium is element number 3. So it has 3 protons. Atomic number 3. And remember, carbon was number 6. Okay, so that's some examples of elements. But there's another way that elements can exist as well. So in some elements, atoms actually join together, like in this example here, where 2 or more atoms join together in what we call a molecule. So molecules are just 2 or more atoms joined together. And the proper name for joining together atoms is bonding. So we say that the atoms are bonded together in a chemical bond. Okay, so let's look at some examples of elements that actually always exist as molecules. And a really common one that we're breathing in all the time is oxygen. So oxygen, its atoms prefer to be joined together in molecules, but it's still called an element because they're all made of oxygen atoms. So we can see here, each one of these molecules is made up of 2 oxygens, so we give it the chemical symbol O2. And we say that all these particles now are individual oxygen molecules. And each molecule is made of 2 oxygens. Okay, here's another type of element that exists as a molecule, and this one's sulfur. So sulfur here, it looks like a powdery, looks like a crumbly cheddar cheese actually. It's a little bit harder than cheese though. And sulfur, when it exists as an element, it actually exists in molecules with 6 sulfur atoms joined together. So each one of these are sulfur molecules. Molecules, if I could actually spell. And then each one of those molecules is made up of 6 sulfur atoms. So oxygen and sulfur here, they're still both elements because they're only made of one type of atom, but they're also molecules because the atoms are bonded together in molecules. Okay, well the other way that atoms can form or can exist is joined together with different types of atoms. And this is the most common type of materials that we see. And these materials are called compounds. So compounds are when 2 or more different types of atoms are joined together or bonded together. Two or more different types of atoms bonded. Right, so here's an example of a whole lot of different compounds. So you can see that some compounds, like these ones, can exist as molecules because they've got only a few atoms bonded together to make a molecule. Other compounds exist in this lattice structure. So they're still a compound because they've got 2 different elements there that make them up, but they're not a molecule.